Good afternoon, Hemp luncheoneers. We have a presentation for you during the lunchtime. If I could catch your attention for just one moment, please. We've got something valuable for you to hear, so you might want to give us your attention, please, for just a moment. My name is Wayne Richmond. I'm the Executive Director of the California Hemp Foundation and the California Hemp Association. And as part of kind of the home team, extended home team, I just want to thank you all for your support in coming here to this fabulous first ever homegrown California Hemp Expo. You should thank yourselves and thank your county officials. You have the most forward-leaning county officials that I know of anywhere in the state. So with that, I don't want to spend much more time. It's been a great day. I want to introduce Dr. Jay Noller, who has more than 6 years experience in researching hemp, primarily out of Oregon, but worldwide. And so he's assured me he's got lots of fabulous things to tell us. I know I'm putting him on the spot because we're like chatting. But anyway, he's an expert. I suggest that you stop your conversations and listen to this gentleman, because if you had to pay for him as a consultant, it'd be a lot more than your lunch. So for no further ado, Dr. Jay Noller. Thank you for being here, Doctor.
All right, thank you. So I'm going to get right into the slides since we're close to the top of the hour. And as a professor, we typically run our lectures late and run over the hour, so let's get going. If we can have the first slide, there we go. Essentially, I want to talk about, you've heard about it this morning, you'll hear about it some more through this afternoon, and of course you'll hear it over the decades ahead. And that is, this is a commodity crop that is hemp, and we'll know it as something that fits within a horticultural realm, that fits within a crop realm, and we'll also see that it fits very well within a synthetic or a closed environment ag realm as well. And so my role today is to provide you with a look at where does hemp fit within the global commodity scheme of things, and also where it could go and where we need to go in terms of looking at the research and then also industrial activity and trade and markets, etc. So with that, I'll get to my first slide. The key points today for this talk. Really, we have a newly invigorated commodity that is slowly and in some cases chaotically coming out of a realm wherein it has been prohibited for decades. In some cases, we're looking at almost a century, depending on what country one's in, and that we're looking at a lot of the enthusiasm is because basically cannabis genus overall has somewhat come out of jail. And so we're looking at what happens when someone comes out of a confined lockup. We'll also look at what research needs are, what research contributions could need to come to industry, look at markets and different production schemes, what we've been doing overseas with our group, and then also ultimately getting to what can this county, this production area of the U.S. can have in a role with hemp. So what we're going to look at is that the closest analog that I can find for this newly emerged, no longer prohibited, although it's still not federally legal as a commercial, it's just decriminalized as it is today, is sugar. And so basically we need to go back to the 1400s to find the closest analog to what we have going on at our present time with this crop. And when we look at sugar, We think about that in the mid 1400s, there are a lot of young guys that kind of have a little longer hair, and they're trying to find some land to go and grow this crop. And one of them, he's a Genoan, and he's been excluded by local folks. He can't quite get land. He goes and he makes a pitch to Queen Isabella. She gives him a couple of ships because he's got a backer on one of the ships. And he goes west and he finds land. And we think of Christopher Columbus as going out to find spices and stuff like that. Well, part of that is the political overlay on what he was really trying to do, and that is he wanted to grow sugar. Because sugar at that time, when you took it and processed its essential oil, broke it down, you came up with a white crystalline isolate of sugar that you would then add into your food, and you could put it on rub. You could do all sorts of things with it. And it sounds very similar to what we see today with isolated CBD. Okay? So you have to think that what we are going through right now, it went through the late 1400s through the 1500s as the 16th century. We have the 18th century where it really starts to go all over the place. And of course here in the U.S., we have a lot of slaves that are coming in, as well as other parts of the world, just to grow that crop. We're not going to repeat that, but we need to know that this is a past that we've lived through before. This is not a fad. This is a crop that is necessary because it's really our companion plant. So when we look at, there are folks around the room here that will talk about the various different products. If you go to NOCO or any of the other hemp expos, you will see that people will talk about the amazing things it can do. It's not that they invented this. We already knew that. It was very much a part of our industrial landscape here in the U.S. It's just that the folks who didn't want to have the more hallucinogenic forms, or for other reasons, and other historians can talk about that at length, it was excluded. But we had, certainly in the mid-1930s, over 20,000. You look at a number of different reports, they're talking about 25,000 different products that it could go into. So when you look at what people are talking about today in terms of 50, 100, whatever the number is in front of the thousands unit, this is, it's the reality that we already knew, and it's just coming back. So when we look at this crop, it missed the scientific revolution. It missed the green revolution. We had physics, chemistry, all these advances in engineering and such, and this crop was out on the side, and it just needs to be plugged back in. And where it needs to be plugged back in is the two words that are really important, and that is essential oils. Now we'll talk about fiber and grain, but essential oil business is known, lavender, basil, you can go on and on, but this is just another crop that produces an essential oil that you can bring up derivatives. So we don't need to make up a lot of things, we just need to bring it into what is already known globally within law space, except we'll talk a bit about it, and that is some of the components people are kind of afraid of, or it's unlawful, or in some countries you could get killed, right? Death penalty. So when we look at the discovery space ahead, it's quite significant because we haven't brought our modern tools to look at this crop. We haven't been able to bring in all of the various knowledge that we've accumulated over the past few decades to look at this significantly. So we need to do that. So there's actually a global need for industrial parks, innovation parks that work close, nearby production areas, certainly for the next 20 years, that are near where it's being grown. And we need to have people coming in these global industrial parks. This is kind of the line that I give around the world in my various talks, is that you need to set up industrial parks that are really focusing on this crop, because there's so much that has to be done, and that it's not that you're trying to carve out a piece of the pie, it's that the pie is growing faster than you can imagine, and you need to stay in your wedge and just hope that you can survive long enough. It's a really different sense of optimism that one has to look at this. and that it's not about excluding others or saying I'm better than such and such. We're not at that point. We're not going to be at that point until I'm dead, hopefully 30 or 40 years from now. But it's going to be half a century or more before we can look back. Don't listen to a historian who's telling you about the history of the moment, because history is always back in time, and you need to have a full generation before you can look at it. So we're in a time when there is a bit of irrational exuberance, but there's also a lot of rational basis for it, and that's what I want to get you through this talk. So let's look at the sugar analog model, and that is that just as it was in Europe in the late 1400s, where all of a sudden it was on the market and all the royalty and everybody wanted to get a hold of this and put it into stuff. And, they're inventing sugar cookies at this time, at least in the Western civilization. So we're now looking at how do we bring this plant into your various edibles and other uses to get the effect. In that time, the effect, when they looked at sugar, it had all sorts of purported medicinal qualities, and that it could save and do all sorts of things, which we now know doesn't work out. So there is reason to be somewhat guarded in your optimism as to what it all can do. So when we look at a global sugar demand today of about 180 million tons of sugar are consumed, or that is produced, I should say, off of about 33 million hectares. So that's about 70 million acres globally where your sugar supply comes from. And it takes up about 4% of the world's arable land. Okay? So that, if we look at that, we look at those who can actually afford to have sugar in their diet. That's about 6 billion people. And that leads to about 30 grams per day is your recommended daily allowance if you look at the Armstrong, Livestrong table of food supplements. So if we look at the cannabinoids, and note that I put CB and then small x here, is that D is just one of the 48 different components that are coming out. So it's just number one. Actually, THC was probably number one. CBD is number two. And then you have G, E, C, N, etc. that are all going to come out. And we already see from various institutions, especially from Israel, we can see it in Switzerland, we're seeing it from some of our med schools, that there are other uses for the other cannabinoids as isolates being moved into products. So if we look at that and say that you're looking at a 10 milligram dose per person per day, and you wonder, like, where does that come from? If we look at anything that you get from CVS or any drugstore, it's over the counter. Typically, the amount that's the recommended dose is about 1/20th, 1/15th of what is the prescribed dose per day by a physician. It's usually where we're at. So when you're looking at what's coming over the counter, you're way down at the 5%, maybe 8% of what would therapeutically be delivered to you by your doctor as prescribed. So if we do that, you end up with, for this many people, just for CBD going into, say, drinks or food or something like that, like a sugar-like supplement, that's 20 million tons of just CBD isolate. And if we look at what's being produced this year, we're at maybe 0.3 million tons. So you can see that we're way in deficit in terms of supply. So the demand is certainly there, but the demand is at a price that's not what you're used to, which means that you're going to see in terms of economics much greater land production, much lower price per kilogram of the produced material, and we see that that moves against the producer. So one of the things when we look at this crop is that, like any other commodity, is that the margins are going to become rather small at the production site, and then they become larger as one moves the material along into how it's delivered to market. So at the end of this season, probably at that 8%, we still have 90% space just on this one component, and we still have dozens more to look at. Okay? I just want to underline that. So it may feel like a bubble, but it's an expanding pie, and you're not used to that because we haven't had it for a crop since the 1400s. So we want to say for a university professor such as myself, what can research do? So since I have been looking at hemp since 2014 with the Farm Bill that came up, we had a big sort of to-do in Oregon. We had two of our senators, Merkley and Wyden, had co-sponsored language that went into the 14 bill such that we could, as universities, look at it. We went in looking at it. There were a bunch of bumps, but for our campus at Oregon State University, we've been working with the crop since the 1800s. So if we look at the USDA ARS equivalent of the time in the late 1800s, the researchers were there in Corvallis. And we had about 50 years of trials and looking at hemp. There were satellite locations like in Arlington, et cetera, that were looking at it as well. But the two chief researchers were in Oregon, and we're just bringing it back, so to speak, to the West Coast where if you look at all the various products, it does very well. So we have now over 60 faculty, it says 50 here, and we're in 8 colleges, so engineering, pharmacy, et cetera. So we're finding there's a great demand from industry, but also just researchers want to be able to get in and explore and innovate with this. And we use a research consortium model, which I'll talk about next. So the key thing when I was looking at expanding our research footprint in 2015 was to look at, so where are the principal current day in 2015 major production areas for hemp? And they were in Eastern Europe and they were in China. And so it took me 3 years before I could actually get into China and look at it in a significant way. But certainly got into Eastern Europe, and that's where in Serbia in particular, so I just harvested my 4th large crop where we're growing hundreds of acres of research plots. I'll show you some pictures in a bit. That's fiber grain, and then of course essential oil. And now in the 2nd year in China, where I have research plots from the southern, middle, and northern provinces, where we're looking at G by E, that is genetics by environment, but also learning about how local folks and their faculty are working with the crop. So we grow hemp at 10 of our 13 ag experiment stations. So we have 13 growing zones, similar to California, except we don't have the lower, say, photo period that you all enjoy at this third of the way between the equator and pole. We're halfway in between. And what we see is that the research that has been done in the U.S. has been around in the 40s. And if we look at how hemp shrunk into the smallest land areas for production, it's all around that 45th parallel. So what we need to think about now is how that this crop gets out of its dominant latitude that it's most productive at, and to look at it southern. And of course that's one of the reasons why I'm in China, because they have, and you can look at it in India and other these low latitude areas where there are varieties that do well. It's just they're not in the essential oil category that does better at higher latitudes. So just for you all to know, we are now have signed up with the Brawley Research Center, which is, or the Imperial Valley Research Center in Brawley. I'm now licensed to manage hemp variety trials. I'll talk a bit about that coming up. And that's part of our research consortium around genetics, breeding, and genomics. So in that, we have our faculty, students, and also the faculty that are at over 80 different institutions around the world that we interface with and that we can tap into. So if industry is interested, they just plug into our network, and we're able to address questions and do the innovation within that local domain, wherever the industry partner is, and certainly where our colleagues, both within governmental institutions as well as within universities. So we have essentially around this consortium membership of industries, and also the faculty or individuals within can innovate and create their own companies that then are set up within that consortium. And then of course we have the federal and state agencies. So we're now in our second year of federal funding. So we've had federal funding before others, and we have state and of course strong industry that helps us move this along. When we look at our various consortia, this is our top list of the main ones, and then we're just inventing these as we go along. What's of interest, especially here, is looking at the ag production side as well as the genetics, breeding, and genomics and how that lines up. But then we also have looking at all the spin-off products that would come out. And if we look at things such as the animal health and nutrition, so we're now starting our 4th and 5th animal trials. So this goes from large mammals. So we use cow, goat, sheep as models. And then also for human health, some co-PI on a number of grants where we're using rat and mouse models, looking at cannabinoids that go into that. So our research plots, we grow defined varieties, and then those are brought in. We process them, move them through, and then they go into our medical and health studies. So for plant breeding, genetics, genomics, this is one of the key things is that we have quite a number of breeders in Oregon. If you look at the number of registered breeders, it's just under 500 right now. And I think of those, you're probably looking at 100 that are really moving things along versus somebody just working on their own plant backs on their own land. But within that group, we have significant interest to see how those varieties will do at these other locations. So we manage variety trials, and we're starting this next week here in Brawley to look at varieties that are coming in, being submitted by breeders from around the U.S. that will be contributing and will be managing those variety trials over the winter. So that's one place. We're also quite involved in seed certification. So Oregon has it along with 3 other states. California is not quite there. But nationally, we're all looking for the national rules. But at least we have that coming along. I'm also a member on the National Variety Review Board that's looking at the hemp varieties that are being proposed. And that's separate from the PVP, or the Plant Variety Protection Act, that's managed by the USDA. So it's a parallel track, and that's something that these breeders are looking at. How does their breed, their line, perform at this latitude, in this environment, over these rather short days here in this area? All right, thank you. Now you can hear me? Sorry about that. We're also looking at lab standards. That's one of the things when we look at especially international trade, is I'm trying to move that forward so we can actually move plant biomass to other countries. The lab standards become very important, and so those are rather advanced at this point. and then of course the ag production, and that's why we're here. We're here to look at how the crop can grow in different environments under different solar climates, and how that can be acclimatized to that to that production area, and then look to how that can leapfrog into other areas. So certainly something that's happening here becomes relevant to northern Mexico. So we just see that this could become a leapfrog for hemp production just south of the border as well. So I want to talk about markets and production, and this is where it's a commodity, which means if we look at the price, which is on your vertical axis, and then your time axis below, we're seeing the price come down. People say it's crashing, but if we look at the net income of producers, their acreage is actually going at a much steeper curve, and so their overall net production is going up, even though the net profit from a unit area of land is going down. So again, these are the dynamics that we need to be careful when we hear somebody run a headline like the market's crashing. It's like, well, what line are we talking about? And we expect certain lines to be steeper going down, and others are steep going up. So we're seeing production going up, we're seeing that go down, but that's because there's this large demand, and when we're only thinking of a domestic demand, then we're looking at a limited pie size. But when we're looking at how far advanced the U.S. is within this space, is that there's a lot of demand outside the U.S., and it's just a matter of getting things set up so it can be exported. And so you see in this curve, there's also the other thing about the big box stores, or the large producers, manufacturers, and that is it can drop until finally you now have assured production of a significant size such that a 2, 3, 5-year contract can be written for supply, and then you see the bump come up, and then it trails off over time. And then it becomes a market, and it becomes quite noisy as you get more advanced to the right. And of course, for things we have to, it's chicken and egg. Does the market come up or the production? And of course, people will point to Canada and say, well, look at that. You know, they went and grew it and blah, blah, blah. And yeah, they're right, they did. But it was also, they had to substitute, they had to convince other people not to eat wheat, not to eat other protein sources. And that's kind of hard to do when you're saying, eat hemp hearts, it's better for you, but it's more expensive, and so why would somebody want to substitute that in? So in this case, we have a market that is really drawing producers into it versus producers coming in and then a market showing up. So your cannabinoids are going to, of course, that's what's going to generate the cash at this point in time. That means for certain areas to get into the grain and the fiber. And our research overseas, especially over in Europe, is looking at the tri-cropping, and that is we get the cannabinoids, the seed and the fiber, but not in the aerial quantities that one gets from the current production practices here, but overall with the various lines of material going forward, we see it as being much more profitable to look at it looking like corn versus what it is now, a Christmas tree lot. So we're looking at research and, of course, industry coming in with machinery, coming in with knowledge about how do we scale up the production. Because right now we're dealing with a scaled production model that comes from basements, closets, and it's not very helpful for a large area that we're talking about thousands of acres. So what everyone needs to know in the beginning, if you're not familiar with the crop, if this is new to you, I thought to give a few minutes to talk about this, and that is basically what are the products and what are the how one would go about growing it. And we'll look at how it's being grown now, and then how we envision it being grown in the future. So if we look at things, we need to also think about that once you do have a production system, know that that production system, again, is very dependent on your environment. And so the very hot summers here will need to be acclimatized to varieties, or it's just not going to work out. So it may be that this area is a winter hemp cropping area, or and I'll talk a bit about that as we go forward. But for those, of course, it's been talked about today, but again, I have to say, they look alike, hemp versus marijuana. It's all the genus cannabis, and there's quite a bit of disagreement. We're looking at 1, 2, 3 different species, subspecies, etc. That's going to be a taxonomist will argue for centuries, so that won't be settled. But basically, we're looking at a politically drawn line. Unfortunately, it was 1%. And they said, did you dry it? No. So you got to be at 0.3 because it didn't account for water. That's helpful. But within the marijuana, of course, that's your higher THC, and that's not what we're talking about for the hemp. Really what we're talking about is that the 0.3 or below. And then, of course, we're looking at the international, who just came out with their, it needs to be 0.2, because the French and Germans really like that number. Whereas 1%, I think, for total is probably the more rational number. We'll be able to test it assuredly in all countries, in all places, and that's where I hope we will go, because there's no, that was the original intent with 1%, and now we have these fractions is just doesn't make sense. So with it, this is a busy slide, but again, when you're talking about something that can produce tens of thousands of different products, that's what you have to look at. So in this case, industrial hemp, and note that with our farm bill that just passed, this is now known as hemp. So if you put industrial in front of it, then, well, you're now defining, but it's not by law. It's just a category for industry or for your market. Okay. And so within the old classic industrial hemp crops, that is grain or fiber, those varieties, as you can see here, the grain on the left, the various different products that come out of that, and of course the stalks, that is your bast fiber, B-A-S-T, and that's where you pull out things for textiles, ropes, etc. Okay. Now what we see now in this current era are the flowers, so the floral, the upper parts, the outer parts of a multi-branching crop. So if you looked at it sort of linearly, the fiber is a single stalk, or actually as we produce it, it's multiple stalk, but it's all vertical, not much of any branching. You don't want branches. Grain, you want some branches, and then on the floral, you want lots of branches. So you can kind of think of it as 0 to many branches as you go from the fiber to grain to your floral. And within, of course, what you're seeing in this county right now is within your essential oil hemp or your floral hemp. And of course, that's going off for your various extraction schema for the desired end products. And then, of course, the whole plant is another way, and when we really look at this in the future, this is where we'd like to see it, and that is you're segregating in the field at harvest, you're segregating into these different domains, and that you're able to pull off 2 to 3 of these different types from your field along the way. Okay. So currently the goal in the U.S., the desired goal is to have at harvest virgin female hemp plants, and that they've not been pollinized, and that they have just full terpenes, and your cannabinoids have been pushed out, and so that's something that certainly is well known within your closed environment space, and so the demand for having feminized seed is quite high right now, or you're using clones. So it's a tissue culture clone, micropropagation, seeds that are reliably feminized is what the industry is planting out on the landscape. And that's because the endpoint, the desired endpoint, is for the virgin female plant at the end of season. If we look at, of course, how it's planted, direct drill or transplant, so the transplant could be the clone or it's a seed that was started in a tray and you've moved it out. And so you're looking at a vegetable or a strawberry planter, and then you have an established field. And of course, a lot of this is because right now we don't have anything that can intervene with disease and such, and so having good airflow around the plants is important to reduce the incidence of powdery mildew, and also growing in areas where late in the season you don't get rain, so botrytis and other things, other diseases aren't likely to come in. So we see there is sense to having separate plants that are identifiable, that is, you could name them across the landscape. But in the long term, particularly our experiments are, we don't have names, we just have names for the fields. When we prepare the fields, we're seeing all sorts of new farmers coming in that haven't farmed, and so they're doing things that we thought we had gotten rid of back in the 1930s, like putting rows up and down the slope, which leads to erosion, and also for folks to fully bare ground what was a 50, 60-year-old pasture, and that was unnecessary. So we're seeing significant soil carbon being lost across the U.S. this year by hemp farmers because they've come in and they've released it to the atmosphere, and did this unknowingly because, in part, we have a lot of state departments of ag and the universities are still behind, waiting for the USDA to come out with its rules before they feel comfortable. Our university is different. We decided just to go ahead. So if we look at it, we can see drip lines underneath. I'll show that in a minute. We also have the full center or linears overhead spray on that. And depending on your growing environment, this is useful, but not late in the season when you could wash your trichome material off the surface. You certainly don't want to do that. That's money. But this is also a means of using established agricultural equipment, which hemp should be grown as your fields have been set up, because it's a rotation crop. We're not looking at a hemp after hemp after hemp. It's hemp followed by something else, followed by something else, and then you go to hemp. So when folks tell me they got 100 acres and they planted all 100 to hemp, I said, so what are you going to do in the future? You know, you're going to grow hemp next year? Oh, yeah. And the year after that? Yeah. And I said, well, that's just a magnet for disease and problems. So the reason why we have crops that rotate is that it's a way of mitigating, certainly in an organic matter, a management scheme that doesn't bring in new disease and new problems. So if you buy new land, 1/3, 1/4 actually goes into hemp. And then you look to rotate in, because you need to learn how to manage your other crops that you're going to rotate. So hopefully you're not doing that. Because for now it's an organic crop, because we don't have registered chemistries to put on. That's going to be slow, but once it eventually comes up in 5 to 10 years, you'll see product suppliers on the side. And it all depends on where you're marketing the material. If it's smokable, usable, then it's probably all organic. If you're doing your cannabinoids, then there'll be a question in there. But if you're doing fiber or grain, you're probably using anything like you would do with corn or soybean, anything like that. All right. So when we look at the different harvest methods, of course, there's the hand pulling. You can see the one of the fiber that's being shucked, biomass coming through just either with a cut bar or the more larger, and I'll show you some pictures on that. Then, of course, a lot of folks are coming in early first, high grading the crop, that is giving it a manual haircut with crews, and then that's going off for dispensary sales or smokable, some other use like that. And then the rest of the plant is then going to a bulk extractor. So of course grain, hemp varieties are all set up so that you can just use equipment like you would basically any of your other cereals. The biomass, like I talked about, is just a lower haircut, if you will, or just a cut bar at the bottom. And then of course where we're heading as an industry is where you're really pulling the 2 to 3 products off, and that is you have the upper header and then you have a cut bar below that leaves your either chopped material behind or actually the stalks that are then going to go to a fiber use, such as this machine. So these types of machines, or this style of production, means that at harvest time you don't have virgin female plants. Now, of course, as we look in the future, hybrids coming in, and then there are other strategies to get that, but we're just not there yet. So we're still years away. And for folks who are growing for various other products, like you're growing for the higher THC, you're looking at being indoors with filters because the outdoor growers are going on. These are conditions we call conflict management or coexistence, or as I hear often, we'll sue you. And so these are dialogues we're used to in production ag, and we just need to know that ultimately the end point is going to be that we don't need so many people out working in the fields, that we can produce greater quantities, and I think we can still get there organically. It's just going to take a lot of strong efforts, especially in the research side. All right. So again, when you're looking at machines that are taking the 3 off, we're doing pretty good. So we find that with some nominal pollination in the field, we do get some seeds, but we also find that we're getting higher cannabinoid loading from the crop. So to have it 100% virgin female, we're finding it isn't quite there, and that you need to have some males to help kind of push along. They're a plant, they like to have sex, you need to, that gets them energized. It's not a bad thing. So let's look at the U.S. situation and where Imperial County sits within this. So basically the production is where the brown is low net primary productivity, and then your dark green is high primary productivity. That is what plants, generally speaking, growing out of doors, are going to do best down in Florida versus, say, the desert Southwest. So you can see that that's, and this, of course, is the 100th meridian that basically separates various domains. And so if you're looking at what is the long term, that is several decades ahead in terms of hemp production, and that is it's going to look like everything else that they're growing in that area. If they're growing for grain, then you're probably looking at grain hemp because it's going to comport with the whole production mode. If you're growing for horticultural fruits, things where plants are specifically putting a lot of energy into, you're looking at those places, and that's pretty much on the west side of the country. So we're going to see essential oil hemp is going to be a dominant force, and we're already seeing it. I'll show you in a slide in a minute. On the western part, we're much better at producing it just because of the environment than the eastern half of the U.S. So if we look at the various types of materials that are being grown, if we look at the net primary productivity, it decreases up to the north in the eastern half. And so we're going to see that And also that gets closer to the 45th parallel, so states like New York, Pennsylvania, Iowa, Minnesota, Maine, along with Oregon, Washington, Idaho, etc., Montana, that northern tier level of states are going to do very well with outproducing others along that longitude line. So if you go south, they're just not going to produce as much as you will get farther north. We will have varieties and production practices that will run counter to that, but this is just basic biology that you're going to always be running up against. So with the lowest net primary productivity, that's mainly because of rainfall. So that means if you have irrigation, you can essentially replicate the advantage you see in the east, except you get to have the advantage of the west, and that is you get to control the water. Hence, if you look at where grapes are grown, anything where the plant needs to be stressed late in the season, we see that's primarily on the western part of the U.S. And so, again, an essential oil hemp is going to do better over here than it will out east. So that means with the irrigation, closed environment are going to be the principal two ways that we're going to see that acreage that's quite abundant in the west. We wouldn't consider them fully arable soils, but you bring in the water or you bring in controlled systems, like in a desert area like here, you're going to be able to produce quite a bit of product at the end. So last month, all the universities got together in Kentucky, and we compared notes to see where we were in terms of the 2018 season for the 30-odd states that had conducted research. And what we find is that for the production that we've had in Oregon is twice that in Oregon and is about 5 times that of the East Coast. So this gradient then also follows the north-south gradient. We're seeing much higher production as you get closer to 45, either from the north or from the south. But again, this means that the breeders really need to step up to counter this, because that's just this given population that we have today, and that with breeding efforts, we should be able to see other parts of the country, other parts of the world be able to participate, and so that this multifold differentiation is not as great. Okay, so this is early in the game, and this is what it looks like. We'll see how this runs out over time. These are probably the biggest numbers difference ever, and we're just going to see that decrease. But again, east versus west, it's better to be west if you're growing essential oil hemp. Okay. So I talked about you buy some land, and now you're going to go in and grow hemp. So in your first year, you probably do it across the whole thing, which means that 2/3 next year is going into something else, because you still want to grow hemp. Or you can defy nature and grow it year after year, but you won't like yourself in the 3rd and 4th year, and then your fields are kind of out for a long time because you've now brought in your nasties, and now they're resident in the soil, and you're going to be wishing for some biofumigant, which you can't get anymore, and you're doing organics, so now what? So you have to think ahead on this. So you have to think about what your substitution crops are, what are you rotating with. So if you look at this graph, you have the existing crop acreage, 100%, basically the top of that vertical purple line. And so you would introduce 1/3 of your land into hemp, and then you can, in your next round, go to another 1/3. And note that this isn't exactly a 1/3, because you have land for roads in between, you have to have some processing facilities. So if you wanted a general rule, it's 1/4 of your land is for maintenance, roads, etc., and access points, storage, parking, etc. And then you're looking at dealing with that other 3/4. So, and those are just general, right? So if we look at your production costs and risks are really about assuring that you're going to meet the endpoint and that the state or county aren't going to destroy your crop because you went hot. That is, the THC went too high. So you have to be testing along the way. Just because somebody delivered something that says this is what the growth curve looks like, I wouldn't believe it. They don't exist yet. Those usually take 15, 30 years before I would believe somebody's production chart. And we're not there. We still have to run out another 10 to 25 years before I would start believing somebody's production curve. So that means you have to be paying attention throughout the field season, and you're taking chemistries, you're looking at your nutrition uptake by the crop, and yes, it's expensive, but thank goodness it's a really profitable crop, because otherwise you're not going to get there. So if we look at hemp coming in as a substitute, we note that in that first epoch where you put, say, a third of the crop in, you get this blue line response in terms of your net farm profit. But if you take the next third or next quarter and go into this, you'll see that the response will not be so great. Because one, the good old years are behind you. And then the second is that even though you're getting smarter, you now have cast your net broader to capture more problems. And you haven't learned enough in your first year to know how to handle a much larger crop. And so we're seeing this replete across the landscape where you're really good the first year, but that second year, it's not so good because it was a lucky year. There were all sorts of reasons why one was successful in the first year, and typically it's because you're managing a smaller land area. And so that's something that's going to change over time, and you need to know things are not linear, they're non-linear, and your response is always going to be changing over time. So if we look at the crops that are going to be substituted in, we have our research to date now, fourth year of looking at different crops. Of course, our colleagues in these different places have looked at others for a long time. But we're finding that when you have your existing crop, let's say, because you're dealing with irrigated land, you're already dealing with a high value crop to begin with. And so of the high value crops, you're looking at your vegetable, that could be your potato, lettuce, greens, whatever that are coming in, and then you're bringing in hemp. It'll be interesting to see what you do in that in the 2 years in between or the 1 year in between, just because you're not going to believe me right now. I would say that if you're looking at the crops that you're coming in, that there's several that you don't want to go. You don't want to have anywhere in your rotation. So we grow a lot of grass seed up in Oregon, so it's anybody who's been doing grass seed, they don't want to do that. We find anybody who put in hemp after grass seed, they got wireworms, bad crop. It's not a good thing. We don't see that down here, but if you are growing various turf grasses for seed and such, you don't want to have hemp after that. You want to have something in between. So with we're finding that potatoes after hemp is a magical thing. The hemp tends to really knock down nematodes, and so we find that the profitable grade A potatoes go up by 2-3 digits. You know, it's kind of crazy. Look at the numbers, say, is that right? And now after 2 years, it's like, okay, we're still in these large numbers. So if you're growing potatoes and you want to have hemp after that. If you're alfalfa, alfalfa is going to be important. You're going to know how to manage it. You'll come in with hemp afterwards, and if you're going to be doing your Christmas tree style, keep it as your interrows, just give it a haircut. But we find that hemp after alfalfa doesn't require any nitrogen, so it's like no nitrogen input, and that it'll suck up that nitrogen well by the time. This is full season. I wouldn't do an autoflower after alfalfa if I had a choice. That leads you to a endpoint where you're just adding your P and K to basically juice up the essential oil at the end of the season. If we look at your other desired crops that you're coming in, that is purposes for hemp, that's off in the future, so you don't really want to get into that, but we also see benefits of your curcubinas, so your squashes, etc. Sorghum is fine, corn, your dry beans, but do not put it after your green beans, because the green beans, you will find your fusarium, all sorts of other things will come in, and your crop won't finish out. So again, the things you want to avoid are going to be grasses, hops, but you don't grow hops here because they're too close. You don't want to have your green beans or like. And we will see that overall, when you're looking at rotation, it's all part of your full farm package. So that it all has to be looking ahead to not only next year's crop, but the crop after that, so that when you do come back into that management block with hemp in 2 to 3 years, you have been purposeful in preparing things so that you don't create barriers unintentionally. Just skip that one. And then the last one here is really about this county and this area. And basically, when I talk to various seed companies, breeders, they're really interested to see, it's not a full analog because the photoperiod dynamics during the winter here at 33 degrees is not fully analogous, but it does give breeders an opportunity to look at how does a winter hemp crop work here, but it also gives them an opportunity at the same latitude for a band across the U.S. To look at. So essentially we're looking at your essential oil hemp crops. You want to think of these as really have 5 different categories of them. You have your full season, and of course it's full season that's planted when? It's planted in the spring, it's planted in early summer, that is post solstice, and then you have a full season winter, which is an opportunity here. And then you have your autoflowers, and that's basically just your degree day, dependent crops, so 50, 70 days, where you could get 2 in. So we're really hopeful that with autoflower here in winter, maybe not. I do ask stupid questions and do stupid things, but that's what research is about. That there's an opportunity to see 2 winter harvests, that is one in December and then another in March. So we'll be looking at that to see how well that might work out. And of course, by having lots of different varieties come in from around the U.S., this presents an opportunity, a gambit, if you will, to see how things perform. There may be some indications, especially for future years, how things work out. And the other thing is just to be able to grow during winter allows for different industry groups to look at performance. It's not exactly alike, but at least they have some live plants that they can be paying attention to during the winter. So this is really a niche that could work out very well here in Imperial County. And so when we look at the band that I'm used to working around the world, I just flew in from Europe on Tuesday. That's my fifth trip around the world. I usually go east around Europe, China, and back to look at my research plots, or the other way. And that's all centered around the 45th, except in China we also go to equivalent latitude there in the central part, and then also all the way down in the southern part. So the green band you see here, that's the equivalent latitude for Imperial County, and this basically shows you your reach to those groups, farmers, industry partners that are similarly aligned and that will be looking at could you actually have breeds that did well here in the winter and then take them out for the spring planted trials along this line, and that selections from that are going to work out very well. So this is one of the things that working with the research center here is to bring numbers of university extension groups from this southern tier of states to have a conference. We're looking to have that in February, where we'll be talking about the results of this current season, to look at and how that might reflect what they want to bring into their variety trials, be it in Texas, Alabama, Louisiana, Arkansas, Georgia, Mississippi, South Carolina, of course New Mexico and Arizona. So this is going to be very important as we look at the national rollout of hemp, that this particular county has a very important role. In fact, I would say the success of hemp in the U.S. is going to very much depend on what happens in this county. And so, because this is going to be the wintering grounds for what is then determined to be across the U.S., especially our southern tier states. But it also, for everyone else farther north, gives an opportunity to look at things. And this is also one step closer to the latitudinal band that Hawaii is in, and of course Florida, and that when we look at the tropics are really anxious to get in and look at, to find high cannabinoid loaded varietals, and this is going to be one of their key places in the U.S. to launch that effort. So this is a variety trial. You can see the blocks that I manage over in Serbia. You can see we have from left to right, a essential oil, a grain, and a fiber, and you can see how close they are. So when people say you need pure isolation, I think as we get more and more of our data, we still need this year, may go with another year, but I don't see that as a problem. So there's plenty, thousands, if not probably 99% of producers right now would say I'm crazy, and maybe I am. But as we look at the data, and I'm data driven, not culturally driven, I really see that we're moving towards a day when this is the way your crop is going to look, and that's going to be, in terms of the volume of material, it will be able to meet the demand. So for those of you interested, we would really love to engage with you. Both through the center, the research center there, just on the south side of Raleigh, and of course we're setting up our conversations with UC, the ANR, Cal Ag facility here, and of course with the community college. We're here to collaborate to help provide the volume to a tide that lifts all boats. And so please engage. I'm here for the rest of the day, tomorrow, for the next few days, so if you want to find some time to talk, we can certainly do that. And with that, I'll stop and take questions. I think there's a microphone up here. Or back there.
Okay, as I understood it, you don't recommend monoculturing hemp year after year. But here in the arid Southwest, if we grow it in the spring and early summer, and then we put in a fall cover crop or a green manure crop and grow it, till it under, and plant hemp again, will that work? Or do those grass crops that we're using for a cover crop or a green manure crop, do they help or would they hinder?
It's a great question. Do you hear it? Okay. That's a great question. So certainly in areas where you can have several crops, if you're doing an auto flower, so you get part of a year or a harvest from that, you put in another crop, you put in another one, then within a calendar year. So when I'm talking about rotations, it's really about crop after crop after crop. It's not time dependent. And that certainly would be something that you have research facility. We'll tell the state rule for California comes in, and where you actually have Cal Ag and UC Riverside, UC Davis actually able to freely talk with you as I'm able to today. That's certainly something that needs to be done. That's all part of what extension and what ag research focuses on. So, yes, ma'am.
There are certain winery owners in Oregon and parts of California that are claiming a potential issue of terpene taint from hemp and cannabis. Is that something you can comment on?
Well, so that's a supposition, and I haven't seen the data that shows that that's actually happening, and that I think certainly it's one of the things that we're looking at we have our Oregon Wine Institute, and we're looking at even hops production next to wine. So this was talked about years ago when somebody had hops next to wine. They were like, "Rah," and it was shown it's not there. And we're just looking at a plant that's so close to it. So I would say from that hops wine studies that did not affect the wine, that we're looking at something that's very similar, because we're talking about very similar loading in the air. And they're very analogous, and they're very similar. It's just the ratios of myrcene to limonene to linalool, etc., are different. Okay, so it needs to be studied to assure folks, but I find it interesting that wineries don't like having a neighbor when. It was the other way around. It's about coexistence, and it's about talking with folks and making sure that that's the first thing. Don't assume, but also look to have research done to actually answer the question.
Thank you.
Well, first of all, thank you very much for your presentation. You've traveled around the world and seen multiple types of plants from different areas. I've heard different maturation periods for the growth of the plants, and also looking for a plant that's more drought tolerant for this type of area. What are the maturation periods you've seen for plants and that growth cycle for each one?
Right, so the question is about maturation rate. What is the time from plant to harvest, right? So a lot of that is, of course, environmentally driven. This is a rather plastic plant. It's very susceptible to the environment, and it's part of its genetic code is so that it can rapidly adapt to an area. And when it does that, it means that even though it grew really well the year before, now you have it has a totally different look this year because it's still somewhat wild. It's not fully trued yet, such that you can have a reliable plant and then harvest date. And plus, we don't have enough research yet to say, especially on the essential oil hemp, to say what that date is. And so what it means, we're looking, even with the variety trials that pass the past about the 6th, 7th week, we're now going to be looking at every other week, starting to take samples, because we want to chart that to see where we're going with the various components within the plant. And that's what we call acclimatization, that is, get it fixed to an area, which is one of the other reasons why we want to have variety trials, certainly in the winter here now, to look at that as a possibility. Of course, others are doing this on their own. They have trials. There's a number of growers here that have planted populations as I look at them. And so that means that one plant doesn't represent all. It's really many have to be looked at. So that's just because things aren't trued up yet. So we just talk about notionally that 150, 120 day full season, and then your autoflower is 50, 70, but those are really squishy numbers. So yeah, we're not there yet. Any other? All right, I think 2:20, so we got a 20-minute break, I think, according to the schedule. I don't know. I'm going to leave it to the host to come in and tell you what to do, because that's not my job. Thank you again.
Thank you very much. Well, I hope everybody enjoyed lunch, and thanks for the great presentation. We are not going to take a break, but you are welcome to stand up and stretch your feet and go to the exhibitors, but please remain seated for our next panel. Before that, I want to make an announcement. And how many of you signed up for the tours for tomorrow? Okay. If you did sign up for the tours, we need your names. And the reason is because we sold out the tour, and we want to put people on a waiting list. We just were able to get another bus for tomorrow. And so we just need you to go to the registration, make sure we get your name, and then we'll start another list for the second bus. It's going to be about a 4-hour tour. We're going to site in Calipatria, Mallowland, Hopeville, Keithley Williams, and back here. The total tour will take about 4 hours. And I'll be one of the tour guides, so I hope you'll enjoy that. So at this time, I'd like to introduce to you who's going to be our moderator for the next panel, Lawrence Serban. And Lawrence has been in the hemp industry since 1990. He is the current owner, president of Hemp Traders, the largest supplier of hemp textiles in the United States. He is also the owner of Canada Grove, which has developed Hemp Board, a particle board made from hemp. He is also the current chair of the California Industrial Hemp Advisory Board and the former president and board member of the Hemp Industries Association. He has just recently founded the California chapter of the Hemp Industries Association, has been a big proponent of hemp here in the Imperial Valley, and is working with us on to attracting wallboard manufacturers and others to the Imperial County. This panel is going to be on the extraction and processing of hemp. So Leonard, I'm going to turn this over to you. You're all set.
All right, thank you very much. Wow, welcome everyone here. I've been involved in hemp for over 25 years. This is one of the largest hemp crowds we've ever talked to. It's out there, people that are really enthusiastic. So it's great to see everything go. My name is Lawrence Serban. I'm the president and owner of Hemp Traders. We've been in business since 1994. So for about 25 years, I've been working in hemp and have my company specializing in hemp textiles, twine, yarn, rope, webbing, and most recently